He started boxing later than almost any elite heavyweight in history. No decade-long amateur pedigree. No childhood spent in a gym. Just raw hunger, an iron will, and a burning desire to silence every single person who ever doubted him. From the moment he laced up gloves seriously, the clock was ticking at a pace nobody had ever seen before in the heavyweight division. For years, that is all it took. For years, from relative obscurity to standing on the Olympic podium with a gold medal hanging around his neck. For years, from learning the basics to being anointed as the future of British boxing, the future of the entire heavyweight division, and quite possibly the future of the sport itself. But here's the thing about being anointed. Here is the brutal truth that every hype prospect eventually discovers. The coronation is just the beginning. The real work, the real suffering, the real testing of character, that all comes after. Because the transition from celebrated prospect to undisputed world champion is not a red carpet walk. It is a gauntlet, a brutal, unforgiving, merciless gauntlet that has broken better men than most. Anthony Joshua would face that gauntlet head on. He would face bitter rivals who wanted to expose him. He would face world champions who dismissed him. He would face the most experienced heavyweight of his generation on the biggest stage British boxing had ever seen, get knocked flat on his back in front of 90,000 screaming fans, and somehow, someway, find the heart and the legs and the punching power to get back up and rewrite history. This is a definitive story of how Anthony Joshua combined precise structural mechanics, savage finishing instinct, and the mentality of a true champion to conquer the heavyweight division and step into global superstardom. To understand what Anthony Joshua achieved in the amateur ranks, you need to understand just how compressed his timeline was. Most elite heavyweights who make it to the Olympics have been boxing since childhood. They have spent a decade or more absorbing punishment, learning footwork, drilling combinations until the movements are as natural as breathing. They arrive at the Olympic Games as battle-hardened veterans of hundreds of amateur contests, their style fully formed, their ring IQ sharpened to a razor's edge. Joshua did not have that luxury. He came to boxing late, relative to the elite level he was competing at, and yet he moved through the amateur system at a pace that left seasoned observers blinking in disbelief. Within just 4 years of taking the sport seriously, he was competing at the European Championships, then the World Championships, absorbing experience at the highest level of amateur competition with every contest, every round, every exchange. The learning curve was steep, brutally steep, but Joshua was not just climbing it. He was sprinting up it. And then came London 2012. Home soil, a nation watching, the pressure that would have buckled most fighters. Joshua converted into fuel, fight by fight through the Olympic tournament. He demonstrated not just power, though the power was always obvious, but composure, tactical awareness, and the kind of mental fortitude that cannot be taught. You either have it when the lights are brightest, or you do not. Joshua had it. When he stood on that podium with the gold medal around his neck, it was not simply a sporting achievement. It was a transformation. The Olympic gold hardened something inside him. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect about himself, that he belonged at the very highest level, that the ceiling others had placed on him was simply a wall he had not yet walked through. The transition to professional boxing came swiftly, and with it came the full weight of expectation. Every British boxing fan, every promoter, every pundit had an opinion. The hype machine was running at full capacity. And into that cauldron of expectation stepped Anthony Joshua on his professional debut against Wladimir. What the crowd witnessed that night was a statement. Not a gradual, measured introduction to professional ranks. A statement. Joshua came out with crisp, professional fundamentals that belied his limited experience. The jab was long and sharp, controlling the space in front of him. The right hand was heavy and accurate, carrying genuine heavyweight power behind it. And within 90 seconds, it was over. A blitz of combinations, executed with a speed and ferocity that left Leo no answer, brought the referee in to wave it off. In a minute and a half, Anthony Joshua had introduced himself to the professional heavyweight division, and the division had noticed. What followed that explosive debut was something that revealed far more about Anthony Joshua as a fighter than the mere scorecards ever could. Fight after fight, opponent after opponent. Joshua went about the business of his early professional career with methodical, almost clinical precision that was remarkable for someone at his stage of development. Against Paul Butlin, a durable, experienced professional who had been around the block and knew how to survive, Joshua showed something that separated him from the typical power puncher. He did not simply load up and swing for fences. He worked the body. He used a jab to find his range, to establish his dominance of the space between the fighters. And then he went downstairs with heavy, calculated body shots that sapped his opponent's will and energy before finishing the job upstairs. It was intelligent heavyweight boxing from a man who could have simply relied on brute force. Against Hector Avila, more of the same. The jab pinning the opponent, limiting their movement, channeling them toward the corners and ropes where Joshua's length and power could be deployed most effectively. The step-back variation, pulling out of range to make opponents miss before stepping back in with sharp, accurate counters, was already becoming a signature element of his repertoire. These are not instinctive moves. These are trained, drilled, deeply ingrained mechanical habits, and Joshua was executing them with increasing fluency. But then came Mat Leg, and the crowd witnessed something that made the entire arena go momentarily silent before erupting. A short, jolting uppercut. Not a wild swing, not a looping haymaker, but compact, perfectly timed, technically beautiful uppercut delivered with terrifying precision. Connected flush on Leg's chin. The effect was instant, complete, total system shut down. The kind of finish that reminds everyone in attendance, regardless of how many boxing events they have watched in their lives, that they are watching a man whose hands carry genuine, serious, life-altering power. As Joshua continued through the early portion of his professional career, opponents like Konstantin Erich and Denis Baktov stepped in. These were not journeymen. These were experienced professionals with records built against credible opposition, men who had shown the ability to take a punch and keep moving forward. Joshua dispatched them with the same structural foundation: the jab to control distance, the lateral movement to stay out of trouble, the steady accumulation of damaging shots to the body and head, and then the ruthless, uncompromising finish when the moment presented itself. What was being constructed, fight by fight through this early stretch, was not just a win record. It was a toolbox, a comprehensive set of weapons and mechanics, refined and tested against progressively meaningful opposition, that would eventually be deployed on the biggest stages in world heavyweight boxing. Every knockout, every round of boxing, every piece of experience was being filed away, integrated, and built upon. The critics who dismissed these performances as routine early career victories against modest opponents were missing the point entirely. The point was never the opponents. The point was the habits being formed. And the habits being formed were excellent. If the early knockout streak was about building the toolbox, the fight with Dillian Whyte was about finding out whether the toolbox could hold up under genuine duress. And make no mistake, this was genuine duress. The backstory between these two men made this fight about far more than the British and Commonwealth heavyweight titles on the line. Whyte and Joshua had a history that stretched back to their amateur days, a history tinged with bitterness and competitive animosity that had never been properly resolved. Whyte believed loudly and repeatedly that Joshua was a corporate creation, a fighter whose image had been carefully curated and whose opposition had been carefully managed, a fighter who had been shielded from real tests, packaged and marketed to a public who did not know any better. Whyte was positioning himself as a man who would tear down the carefully constructed facade and expose the truth. For Joshua, this was deeply personal. Losing to Whyte and the amateurs had planted a seed of unfinished business that had been growing ever since. This was not just about adding titles to his record. This was about settlement, about proving definitively and publicly that the amateur result was an aberration and that the real hierarchy between these two men was beyond dispute. The atmosphere on fight night was electric with genuine hostility. This was not manufactured bad blood for promotional purposes. This was real. And the fight itself delivered on every ounce of that tension. The opening round exploded almost immediately. Joshua connected with a massive left hook that clearly hurt Whyte, rocking him visibly and sending the packed arena into a frenzy. But the chaos of the moment, the emotion of the occasion, stripped away composure on both sides. What followed the bell ending that round became a near riot, with both camps involved in ugly scenes that underscored just how raw the personal animosity truly was. This was not sport in that moment. This was feud. But the second round delivered the moment that changed everything, and not in the direction most people expected. Whyte, showing the aggressive, pressure-heavy fighting style that has defined his entire career, caught a heavily muscle-bound Joshua coming in. The counter left hook landed flush, and Joshua went backward, genuinely rocked, legs compromised, head snapping, suddenly very much in a fight that he had been expected to dominate. This was the first real test, not a manageable examination of skills against a respectable but fundamentally limited opponent. A genuine, threatening, dangerous test of heart and championship mentality against a man who desperately wanted to take everything from him. What happened in the middle rounds revealed something about Anthony Joshua that the early knockout streak had never truly been able to show. He could weather a storm. He could absorb a serious shot, feel his legs shake underneath him, and find a way to stay composed, stay smart, manage the danger, and allow himself the time to recover. These are not skills that training fully prepares you for. These are skills you either possess when the moment arrives, or you do not. Joshua possessed them. Round by round through the middle portion of the fight, he reasserted himself. The jab came back. The distance management returned. The combinations began to land with purpose and increasing regularity. And then, in the seventh round, with the fight well established as Joshua was on the scorecards, but with Whyte still dangerously capable of producing the single-shot upset, came the finish. A right uppercut, perfectly timed, perfectly placed, rising from Joshua's hip with the full rotation of his body behind it, connecting with Whyte's chin at the exact moment when it could do maximum damage. Whyte went down and did not beat the count. The crowd erupted. The rivalry was settled. The British and Commonwealth titles were secured. And perhaps most importantly of all, Anthony Joshua had answered the most important question a young heavyweight can be asked. Were you made of when things get genuinely difficult? The answer had been emphatic. From bitter domestic rivalry to world title challenge, the jump seemed rapid to outside observers. But to those who had been watching Joshua's development closely, it felt inevitable. The question was never really whether he would get to the world stage. The question was whether he was ready for it. When it arrived, the opponent was Charles Martin, the IBF heavyweight champion of the world. Martin was a rangy, dangerous southpaw with genuine heavyweight power and the kind of unpredictable combination of reach and awkwardness that makes southpaw heavyweights notoriously difficult propositions, particularly for fighters encountering them for the first time on the world stage. Martin also had a considerable gift for self-promotion. In the build-up to the fight, he declared with absolute confidence that he walked this earth like a god. Whether this was genuine belief or calculated psychology was almost irrelevant. The words were designed to get inside Joshua's head, to establish a psychological hierarchy before a single punch had been thrown. The tactical challenge was real. Facing a southpaw of Martin's dimensions for a world heavyweight title, in front of a partisan home crowd expecting victory, with the full weight of British boxing's hopes on their shoulders, this was a fundamentally different pressure from anything Joshua had navigated previously. Even the Whyte fight, as emotionally charged and physically demanding as it was, had taken place within a relatively familiar tactical framework. This was different. Joshua and his team prepared meticulously. The jab alignment against a southpaw, the angles required to land a right hand effectively against a fighter whose natural stance opened different lines than orthodox opponents. Every detail was worked on, internalized, and prepared for execution on the night. What unfolded in the fight was a masterclass in patience and timing from the challenger. Joshua did not try to take the world title by storm in the opening round. He settled in. He assessed. He picked his shots. And in the second round, with the kind of precision and composure that belied his world title inexperience, he found the timing to land a sharp, heavy straight right counter that dropped Martin to the canvas. Martin got up. He always had the option not to. He chose to continue. And Joshua, without the slightest hesitation, immediately went back to work with the same calm, controlled ferocity that had brought the first knockdown. A second right hand, again perfectly timed, again landing with full power transfer, again found Martin's chin. Down again. This time, Martin did not beat the count. Anthony Joshua was the IBF heavyweight champion of the world. The post-fight declaration was delivered with a smile that contained equal parts joy and satisfaction. There are levels to this. Joshua told the world. And in 2 rounds against the self-proclaimed god of the heavyweight division, he had demonstrated exactly what those levels looked like. Becoming world champion is one thing. Proving that the world championship belongs to you, convincing the division, the media, and the watching public that you are a genuine top-tier heavyweight and not simply a fortunate man holding a title, requires something more. It requires defenses. It requires facing men who have earned their way into the position of mandatory challenger. It requires winning those fights convincingly. The first offense brought Dominic Breazeale to London, and with him came all the tension that any contest between an undefeated American Olympian and a British world champion generates. Breazeale had never been stopped as a professional. He was big, he was strong, he was motivated, and he came with the absolute conviction that he was going to expose Joshua as a champion who had risen too fast against too little. The build-up was charged, physically confrontational in the face-to-face moments, with neither man making any effort to disguise the competitive contempt they had developed for each other through the promotional period. This was going to be a fight, and it was, but it was also a demonstration. Round after round, Joshua deployed his full arsenal against a man who was giving everything he had to stay in the contest. The hand speed, which so many had underestimated in a man of Joshua's size, created problems that Breazeale simply had no answer for. The lateral movement, the ability to change angles and reset, meant that Breazeale could never settle into the kind of sustained pressure game that represented his best chance of turning the fight. And the combinations, when they landed with the kind of cumulative damage that slowly, methodically broke down a man who had absorbed everything thrown at him throughout his professional career. 7 rounds. That was how long Breazeale lasted. 7 rounds of increasing punishment, of being outworked and outclassed by a world champion who was visibly growing into the role with every exchange, before the referee finally called a halt to the proceedings. The second American challenger was Molina, a former title challenger with the kind of professional experience that commands respect and the kind of dangerous right hand that demands careful preparation. Joshua went into that fight not just to win, but to learn, to add another layer of professional experience, another set of problems solved, another dimension of ring craft to his already considerable repertoire. What the public witnessed was efficiency elevated to an art form. Joshua did not take unnecessary risks. He did not showboat. He did not allow the occasion to inflate his ego to the point of carelessness. He was a professional doing professional work, hunting Molina down methodically, closing off the angles available to his opponent, and delivering the finish inside 3 rounds with the clinical precision of a true world-class heavyweight. 2 defenses, 2 stoppages. 2 Americans sent home with nothing to show for their efforts except the experience of having been systematically dismantled by a man who was only getting better. And then came Wembley, and then came Klitschko. To understand what this fight meant, you need to understand what Wladimir Klitschko represented. For over a decade, he and his brother Vitaly had dominated the heavyweight division in a way that no fighter since the era of Lennox Lewis had managed. Wladimir alone had held world title belts across multiple sanctioning bodies for the better part of 11 years. He had defeated virtually every credible challenger the division had produced during that period. He had beaten men with greater natural athleticism. He had beaten men with greater natural power. He had beaten men with far more professional experience. He had done it with chess match precision, with suffocating physical pressure, with a technical intelligence that made him enormously difficult to engage at close range. He was, entering this fight, 38 months removed from his last contest. But the question of whether age had eroded the fundamental qualities that had made him the most dominant heavyweight of his generation was entirely unanswered. Joshua was entering his absolute physical prime. The athleticism, the power, the speed, the chin, all of it at its peak. The generational collision of narrative between an aging champion and a prime challenger had never been more perfectly set than it was on this night at Wembley Stadium, in front of a crowd of over 90,000 people that made the atmosphere feel less like a sporting event and more like a force of nature. The opening rounds were Klitschko's, the experience and ring craft of the Ukrainian, the shoulder pressure and stiff jab that had given so many challengers so many problems over so many years, was on full display. Joshua, feeling the weight of the occasion, the volume of the crowd, and the genuinely formidable nature of the man in front of him, was working through the early stages with caution, unable to find the rhythm and timing that had defined his best work in previous outings. And then came the 5th round, and everything changed. Joshua landed a sequence of combinations that had Klitschko in serious difficulty. And then the right hand connected with the kind of precision and power that puts even the most durable heavyweights on the canvas. Klitschko went down. The crowd erupted in a wave of sound that physically seemed to reverberate through the entire stadium. Joshua, sensing the finish, went after Klitschko with everything he had, throwing punches and combinations as his opponent tried to survive to the bell. But Joshua had spent himself. The effort required to drop Klitschko, combined with the effort of the early rounds and the overwhelming physical and emotional demand of trying to force the stoppage before the bell, had taken something out of him. And Klitschko, showing the extraordinary professionalism of a man who's been in exactly this kind of danger before and survived it, weathered the late round storm. The 6th round was where the story truly revealed itself in all its dramatic, brutal complexity. Klitschko, refreshed by the rest between rounds, came out with a purpose and ferocity that had not been evident in the earlier portions of the fight. The straight right hand that caught Joshua flush was delivered with the full weight and technical precision of a man who had been landing that punch at the highest level for the better part of 2 decades. It landed perfectly, and Joshua went down, flat on his back. Staring up at the lights of Wembley Stadium, 90,000 people suddenly hushed and shocked and watching and wondering. This was a defining moment of Anthony Joshua's career up to that point, and quite possibly one of the defining moments of his entire fighting life. Not the gold medal, not the world title victory over Charles Martin. This, flat on his back in front of the biggest crowd British boxing had assembled in living memory, against the most accomplished opponent he had ever faced, with everything on the line. He got up. Of course he got up. But getting up is just the physical part. The harder part, the part that separates the champions from the men who merely hold championship belts, is what you do after you get up. How you manage the crisis. How you get through the remainder of the round against a man who knows he's hurt you, who is coming forward with murderous intent, who smells the finish and is throwing everything he has to produce it. Joshua survived the 6th round. Not comfortably, not without further damage and further difficulty, but he survived it. And in the round that followed, something remarkable began to happen. Klitschko, having produced his best work in the 6th round and failed to finish the job, began to tire. Age, ring rust from nearly 2 years of inactivity, and a cumulative physical effort of 12 rounds of heavyweight combat at the highest level began to show. The combination slowed. The pressure became less relentless. The gaps between his offensive sequences grew wider, and Joshua filled those gaps. His conditioning, the product of years of meticulous athletic preparation, was holding up better than his opponents. The timing that had been slightly off in the earlier rounds began to return. The jab found its range again. The right hand began to land with increasing frequency and accuracy. By the 10th round, Joshua was outworking Klitschko. By the 11th round, he was in control of the fight. And then came the uppercut. There are moments in sport that exist beyond description. Moments with a sum total of everything. The narrative, the drama, the physical perfection of a single technical execution, the roar of the crowd, the weight of what is at stake. Compresses into a single instant that will be replayed and remembered and spoken about for as long as the sport itself endures. The right uppercut that Anthony Joshua threw in the 11th round of his fight with Wladimir Klitschko at Wembley Stadium is one of those moments. It rose from low, from Joshua's hip, powered by the full rotation of his entire body behind it, delivering to the fist with every ounce of the athletic, technical, and muscular development of years of preparation. It connected beneath Klitschko's chin at the exact anatomical point where the effect is maximized, and the Ukrainian giant, a man who had absorbed the best efforts of the best heavyweights in the world for over a decade, who had stood up to power punchers and pressure fighters and every style of heavyweight challenge and division had produced. He went down with a crash that shook the very foundations of Wembley Stadium. But Joshua was not finished. The heart of a true champion will not allow the luxury of standing back and watching a fallen opponent. It demands action. It demands a follow-through. Klitschko attempted to rise, attempted to find his legs and his senses, and buy himself the time to survive. Joshua would not allow it. The final flurry that he unleashed A savage combination of heavy punches delivered with both hands to head and body was not the work of a man running on adrenaline and instinct. It was the work of a man who had drilled precisely the scenario. The hurt opponent attempting to recover, the final finish sequence, thousands of times in the gym, in sparring, in the quiet, grueling, anonymous hours of preparation that the public never sees, but that ultimately determine who wins and who loses when the lights come on. The referee stepped in. The fight was over. Wladimir Klitschko had been stopped for the first time in 14 years. Anthony Joshua was the IBF and WBA unified heavyweight champion of the world. Victorious and arguably the greatest British heavyweight fight in the modern era. Celebrated by 90,000 delirious fans who had just witnessed something they would tell their grandchildren about. The analysis of what had been achieved could fill volumes. The balance that had kept Joshua upright through the sixth round crisis and allowed him to keep his feet moving even when his senses were scrambled. The structural integrity of his defensive positioning that prevented the damage from being even more catastrophic. The power transfer mechanics that allowed him to generate the kind of force, even at the end of a grueling 11-round heavyweight war, that could stop Klitschko in the way he had been stopped. But beyond all of it, beyond every technical detail and every tactical adjustment and every mechanical excellence, there was the heart, the willingness to be knocked flat on your back in front of 90,000 people and get up and win anyway. That is not something that can be drilled in a gym. That is not something that can be built by a strength and conditioning coach. That lives inside a fighter or it does not. And on the night of April 29, 2017, Anthony Joshua proved beyond any possible doubt that it lived inside him. He walked into Wembley Stadium as a young world champion with enormous potential and enormous questions still surrounding him. He walked out as a global sporting icon. The torch had been passed. The new king of the heavyweight division had arrived, and the world was watching.